Welcome back, Gadgeteers. Hopefully you watched my video that I put out a few days ago called Linus Torvalds Leaving Linux Kernel Dev Team. Now, in that video, we did have quite a lengthy discussion about the possible cultural changes that might take place now that the Kernel Dev Team has basically embraced this new code of conduct. We're going to talk a little bit more about that code of conduct, and we're also going to talk about what has happened since that video. Some of the kernel devs have come out with a very harsh reaction to the new code of conduct, so we're going to talk about that right now. If you have a chance, watch this video first. It'll give you an overview of what's going on with Linus Torvalds leaving and basically what's going to happen now that the new code of conduct is in place. What we really want to talk about is an article that appeared on lulz.com and is making the rounds with the political YouTubers out there, but I want to talk about it not because of its political content necessarily, but mainly because it has to do with Linux. As you know, normally I don't talk much about the politics of Linux because for the most part things were status quo. A lot's going to change now, so just a quick recap. Linus Torvalds, lead kernel developer, decided that it was time for him to leave. He's going to take a break. He may be back. It's hard to say, but he's leaving because of an open letter he published basically stating that his attitude towards others and his inability to be empathic and understand other people's emotions and feelings has caused quite a bit of problems, so it's time for him to take a break. Whether or not it's long-term or short-term, the fact is it's caused quite a power vacuum, and in response to that, all the kernel dev leaders decided it was time to institute a new code of conduct, which incidentally all but one have signed off on, and because of that, the new code of conduct was put into effect. And it is the contributor covenant code of conduct that many in the LGBTQIA+ think that it is appropriate, and they've wanted Linux to do this for some time in the kernel dev team. So unfortunately it is in place. We talked about this code of conduct in my previous video, so I'm not going to rehash all that, but since all of this happened, let's take a look at this report from lulz.com. Now, the title says, Linux developers threaten to pull the kill switch. And there is an update by two people we're going to look at. One is Eric S. Raymond, and the other is Richard M. Stallman, that says, yes, the threat does have teeth. Meaning, of course, it could really cause problems not just in the Linux community, but for any organizations or companies that use Linux, or possibly individuals as well. So this is going to cause quite a shakeup in the Linux community, and really the other shoe has dropped. It's not going to be something that's going to happen a year from now or 2 years from now. It could take place even sooner. How damaging exactly it will be remains to be seen. Now, basically, anybody who has contributed code to the Linux kernel does have the ability to rescind the copyright on that code. According to the GPL version 2 license, which is what the core kernel of Linux uses, indicates that you as a person, if you created unique code and it was contributed to the development of the kernel, in other words, it's in the kernel, you also maintain and hold the copyright to that code. And if you so wish, at any time, you could rescind your use of that code in the Linux kernel. That means that the current kernel, basically moving forward, would have to remove that code out of the kernel, and it would possibly cripple the kernel or cause major security or operational problems. We don't know yet how many coders out there are disenfranchised with the new code of conduct, or whether their attitude is, yes, let's go ahead and group together and use this right of rescission and rescind our code and take it away from the kernel. If the new code of conduct does end up causing many of the coders to be removed from the team, they might very well decide to rescind their code, even if it damages the kernel temporarily. And when I say temporarily, we could talk from days to years, depending on how the legalities work out and whether or not something can happen in order to bring those coders back into the fold. So it all started with this open letter posted to the Linux kernel mailing list, and you can check the link. It is legitimate. It's a little easier to read over here, so we'll just read it here. But basically, this person posted to the kernel mailing list, subject, a plan to unfrick our codes of conduct regarding those who are ejected from the Linux kernel community after this code of conduct. Contributors can at any time rescind the license grant regarding their property via written notice to those whom they are rescinding the grant from. GPL version 2 lacks a no rescission clause. The GPL version 3, on the other hand, has such a clause. To attempt to furnish defendants with an estoppel defense, the Linux kernel is licensed under version 2. However, so are the past contributions. If a plaintiff decides to rescind the code and somebody else continues to use it, the plaintiff can sue under the copyright statute. Banned contributors should do this. Note, plaintiff is to register their copyright prior to filing suit. Additionally, when said banned contributors joined the Linux team, they were under the impression that it was a meritocracy. In fact, this belief was stated or ratified by those within the governing body regarding Linux when the contributors began their work. So let's talk a little bit about the meritocracy. By saying that the Kernel Dev Team is a meritocracy, it basically means that those who have risen to their positions have done so through the quality of their code and how they manage relationships to some extent within the Kernel Dev community, but most importantly, the quality of the code. So that's the first thing you're judged on when being a part of the Kernel Dev Team, is the quality of the code that you've added and contributed to the kernel. So if we move away from a meritocracy with the new code of conduct, we're basically saying that everybody is on equal footing, but their code, on the other hand, does not necessarily have to be. So it is likely with the current code of conduct, we would see the inclusion of more non-white, binary as they're called, or cis, which all of that sounds derogatory to me, but basically white males would be the enclave that would begin to be picked at and replaced with anybody else, people of color, essentially anybody that is not a part of the white male enclave. On the surface, there's nothing wrong with that. We want to get people in who can code. We don't really care who or what they are or what they represent or what their religion is or their sexuality or any of that stuff. And it is fair to say that there are plenty of people out there that can code and are capable that are not white males. However, to force it and try to get a mixed group of coders is very tenuous at best. I think that it's important to maintain the meritocracy because the whole concept is that you're actually a good coder. That's the first thing we need, right? When you go and apply for a job, your skill and ability to do the job is the first thing that we want to actually have. It's not whether or not you're gay or lesbian or a different color than somebody else. It really should not be what we're looked at. We should be looking at the quality of the code that you give. So down here at the bottom, they end by saying, for greatest effect, all rescission should be done at once in a block with other banned contributors. Contributors, you were promised something, you labored for that promise, and now the promise has become a lie, which to some extent is true. So lulz.com reached out to a couple of people. One is Richard M. Stallman, who said that he thinks the license revocation plan is misguided. Eric S. Raymond wrote, let me confirm that the threat has teeth. I've researched the relevant law when I was founding the open source initiative in the U.S. There is case law confirming that reputational losses relating to conversion of the rights of a contributor to a GPL project are justiciable in law. I do not know the case law outside the U.S., but in countries observing the Berne Convention with the U.S.'s opt-out of the moral rights clause, that clause probably gives the objectors an even stronger case. So the controversy: activists from the feminist and LGBTQIA plus communities have been trying to force the Linux project to join the contributor covenant since at least 2015. Linux had officially committed to implementing and obeying the CC Code of Conduct, and they immediately set about using it to remove top Linux coders. So basically what we've got here is what looks like a witch hunt. And that's very unfortunate. So with the new code of conduct and all of the lead team developers basically capitulating and saying, yes, we signed off on this, which they did, except for one, the attack is on to start cleaning house. And this is what happens when there's a power vacuum in the structure of any organization, especially when a team lead leaves, even for any short period of time, which is, of course, Linus Torvalds. Sage Sharp, who describes they/self, proper pronoun here, as a diversity and inclusion consultant, Hufflepuff, non-binary, agender, trans masculine, and who cares how many followers she has, it's not enough, who attacked Ted So, who did not sign off on a particular patch that he knew was bad, that would have caused an Intel backdoor into some of the Linux kernel code. And he comments, "I'm so glad I resisted pressure from Intel engineers to let dev random rely on the RD-RAND instruction," to quote from the article below. Anyway, she called Ted a rape apologist, and many said, hey, isn't that a violation of the new code of conduct, which it actually is. So this new code of conduct replaces Linux's older code of conflict. Now, here's some of the arguments about why this is a problem. Other projects have begun some pretty extensive witch hunts into coders and contributors that have been with the organization for a very long time. The lack of proper definitions for punishments, timeframes, and even what constitutes abuse or harassment gives people charged with enforcement omnipotent and unaccountable power. It could force acceptance of contributions that wouldn't make the cut if made by cis white males. CC's code of conduct is purely about power. On the other side of the argument, it does foster an inclusive and safe space for women and LGBTQIA+, and people of color, etc., etc. Lack of CC's code of conduct sustains meritocracy, a bad thing according to this group, and has consistently shown itself to mainly benefit those with privilege to the exclusion of underrepresented people in technology. The vast majority of Linux contributors are cis white males. CC's code of conduct would enable the building of a more diverse overall demographic as people who aren't cis white males feel welcome to join and white male harassers are weeded out. Being against the code of conduct means you want women, LGBTQIA+, and people of color to be harassed. Not so, not at all. I feel, though, that there has to be some kind of comfortable medium, but I don't think we're going to get it with this code of conduct. Unfortunately, this whole political situation that's kind of surfaced in the Linux kernel dev team really is going to be problematic. Now, I said in my previous video that I stated that originally there was somewhat of a necessity to include a code of conduct like this because, unfortunately, men can behave badly. And I know that's an unpopular thing to say, but Linus Torvalds himself explains how he behaved badly, and others have behaved badly in the past. And through history, when you go back in time, consider the 50s and 40s, and how women felt and people of color working for different organizations. So there had to be some response to offer some kind of equality, but I really don't feel like it could be done with a policy, at least not this policy. It remains to be seen what's going to happen to Linux, but we talked about some possibilities before. That nuclear option of code rescission is a possibility. I don't know how many coders there are that are being thrown on the wayside that might consider doing this, rescinding their code, forking of the kernel. Unfortunately, if you fork the kernel, you could create a new development group, but the core license would still be GPL version 2, and if any of the code is used, it's going to be GPL version 2. You might be able to do something where the added code that gets added to a kernel is GPL version 3, but I don't think GPL version 2 allows that. So that means it would have to be a ground up build of a kernel under the GPL version 3 license if you want to stop the rescission, the ability of these coders to pull their code copyrights out and keep you from using it. So it would pretty much have to be a whole new kernel. Now, I find all of this very ironic because you've got this company like Microsoft and Google that have built a lot of their code infrastructure on the Linux kernel, and especially Google with Android. And now Android is working on, Google is working on another operating system that will replace Android at some point, and it's all coded in-house. So whatever GPL they use, Google is the owner of the code. So the sooner they replace Android, the better. But this atmosphere that they have espoused in their organization is exactly what's happening here to the Linux team. And it's ironic because it causes great instability in their guarantee of being able to have this Linux kernel that is basically guaranteed to be produced and put out on a regular, consistent basis and include all of the code that was there before. So it's possible it could cause an inherent and large destabilization of the code base of Android and could affect the rolling out of patches. And that's what happens when you get this ultra leftist leaning, ultra liberal, call it what you want, toxic atmosphere where we attack people for who they are and what they are and not for what they provide to the organization. In this case, code. And that is a big problem. What do we do about it? Well, I think we've talked about that in my last video and in this one, and there's not a whole lot we can do. The code of conduct has been adopted. It was signed off by all the major team leaders, even Linus Torvalds, and I only think he would have done that if we were pushed into that position. So we only know about his behavior from what he published in his letter. I could be wrong, but usually the problem goes far deeper than what you see on the surface, just like an iceberg. And unfortunately, depending on how you see him, hero Linus is not going to come to the rescue. And this code of conduct has definitely been applied. And I think what will happen is people like Sharp here will chill a little bit because they kind of have to because of the coders, and wait for a more benign weeding out of these bad coders, the bad people who are sexist, which is basically anybody who's a white male, but hey, whatever. And they're going to wait, and eventually when there's an infiltration of more leftist liberals, at that point I would expect them to take more direct action. And I think the bottom line is it will cause a dilution of the quality of the Linux kernel and Linux code in general. That is what will happen in the end. That's why I'm thinking, kind of like OpenOffice and LibreOffice, there was a fork there. At some point, there probably will be a fork in the Linux kernel, and maybe Torvalds will take a core team and they'll take all their code that they represent with them, and they'll work the way they've been working, and the current kernel team will die a terrible, untimely death. And during that period of time, the kernel will not be as good as it's been. So this will hurt Linux in the long run for a little while, maybe long term. We'll find out. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you check this article out for yourself and see what you think. Drop me a comment. Many of you have dropped me quite a few comments in the last video, and many of you don't agree with what I say. And because it's political, everybody's got an opinion and everybody is right, just in case you don't know. except for me. But that's okay. I don't really care. This is just the way I see it. And, you know, I've had quite a bit of experience in the Linux community over the last several decades. So take it for what you will, or don't. It's up to you. I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/fastgadgets.